You people need to learn your place, and that place isn't in my first-class cabin." The words cut through the morning air at Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3 like a blade delivered with the kind of cold authority that Captain Blake Morrison had perfected over 25 years of flying. He stood over the young black woman in seat 2. His platinum blonde hair catching the overhead lights, his 4-stripe uniform pressed to military precision. What he didn't know was that the woman he was addressing owned every thread of that uniform, every rivet in the aircraft, and held his career in her hands. In exactly 37 minutes, Captain Blake Morrison would discover that the place he was so concerned about belonged entirely to her. Maya Washington pulled her oversized gray hoodie tighter around her shoulders as she navigated through the bustling corridors of Chicago O'Hare, her worn Converse sneakers silent against the polished terminal floors. At 28, she looked like any other graduate student catching a morning flight, maybe heading home for the holidays or traveling to a conference she couldn't really afford. Her dark jeans were deliberately faded, artfully ripped at the knees, in a way that suggested thrift store finds rather than designer distressing. The canvas backpack slung over her shoulder had seen better days, its straps frayed from years of use. And when she pulled out her phone to check her boarding pass, the cracked screen protector caught the fluorescent lights above. Most people would have dismissed her entirely, which was exactly what Maya wanted. They wouldn't notice the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, or the flash of platinum and diamonds on her wrist when her sleeve rode up just slightly. That watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people's annual salaries, was the only visible hint of the empire she had built from nothing. Maya had learned long ago that in her world invisibility was power, and assumptions were weapons she could turn against those who wielded them carelessly. She was the founder and controlling shareholder of Phoenix Capital Group, a private equity firm that specialized in rescuing failing companies and transforming them into industry leaders. Her $12 billion portfolio included everything from tech startups to manufacturing giants, but her latest acquisition was personal. 3 days ago, she had quietly purchased 72% of Skyline Airways, a legacy carrier that had been hemorrhaging money and passengers in equal measure. The airline's current CEO, David Park, was one of only 4 people who knew Maya's true identity. The others were her Aunt Rosa, who had raised her in Detroit after her parents died in a car accident when she was 10, her attorney, Sarah Kim, and her best friend from MIT, Dr. James Liu, who now ran Phoenix Capital's technology division. To everyone else in the business world, Maya Washington was a ghost. Her company's acquisitions were handled through a maze of shell corporations and legal entities that kept her name out of headlines and her face out of boardrooms. She preferred it that way because it allowed her to do what she was doing right now, walking through an airport dressed like a broke college student about to board one of her own aircraft to conduct the most important investigation of her career. For the past 8 months, Maya had been receiving anonymous complaints through encrypted channels, detailed accounts of discrimination and abuse aboard Skyline Airways flights. Passengers reported being questioned about their ticket validity based on their appearance, being asked to move seats to accommodate the comfort of other travelers, being ignored by flight attendants, and in some cases being removed from flights entirely on trumped-up charges of being disruptive. The complaints painted a disturbing picture of a company culture that had rotted from the inside, where bias and prejudice were not just tolerated but actively encouraged by management. Maya could have sent investigators. She could have ordered internal audits and demanded policy changes from her executive suite. Instead, she had chosen to experience the truth firsthand, booking flights under her real name but dressed to trigger exactly the kind of treatment these complaints described. Over the past 6 months, she had flown Skyline Airways routes in economy and business class, documenting a pattern of behavior that made her sick to her stomach. Flight attendants who smiled warmly at white passengers while barely acknowledging her existence. Gate agents who questioned her boarding passes with suspicious eyes. Security personnel who seemed to find reasons to subject her to additional screening. But she had never flown first class until today. She needed to know if the discrimination was worse at the top, where the stakes were higher, and the sense of exclusivity was most pronounced. Flight 847 to Miami would be her final test, and depending on what she found, it might also be the flight that changed everything for Skyline Airways. As she approached Gate B-12, Maya spotted the familiar blue and silver livery of the Boeing 777 that would carry her to Miami. The aircraft looked pristine from the outside, its paint gleaming under the morning sun, the Skyline Airways logo prominently displayed on the fuselage. She owned every bolt and wire in that machine, but to the crew preparing for departure, she was just another passenger who probably didn't belong in the premium cabin. Captain Blake Morrison stood in the cockpit of Flight 847 reviewing the passenger manifest with the kind of scrutiny most people reserved for tax audits. At 48, he possessed the sort of commanding presence that airline marketing departments loved to feature in their advertisements, all silver temples and square jaw with platinum blonde hair that was always perfectly styled even after long international flights. His uniform was tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and minimize the slight softness around his midsection that had developed over 25 years of airline food and irregular schedules. Blake had grown up in Winnetka, Illinois, where his father had been a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, and his mother had served on the boards of 3 different charitable organizations. He had learned early that the world was divided into categories of people who mattered and people who didn't, and that maintaining those distinctions was not just important but essential to preserving order and standards. His path to the cockpit had been smooth and predictable. Northwestern University Air Force, ROTC military service, flying transport aircraft, and then a seamless transition to commercial aviation, where his background and connections had opened doors that remained closed to others. In his mind, Blake wasn't prejudiced, he was simply discerning. He understood that first-class passengers paid premium prices for an exclusive experience, and part of that exclusivity meant maintaining certain standards of dress behavior and background. When he saw names on the passenger manifest that didn't fit his mental image of who belonged in premium cabins, he considered it his professional duty to investigate. After all, he was the captain, the final authority on the aircraft, responsible for the safety and comfort of everyone aboard. The name that caught his attention this morning was Maya Washington, seated in 2A. First-class full fare purchased 3 days ago with what appeared to be a corporate credit card from some company called Phoenix Capital. Blake had never heard of Phoenix Capital, which immediately made him suspicious. Legitimate high-net-worth individuals flew with companies he recognized: Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, J.P. Morgan Chase. This Phoenix Capital sounded like the kind of boutique firm that gave people inflated titles and expense accounts they couldn't really afford. His first officer, Jennifer Kim, was completing the pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had made her one of Skyline's most reliable pilots. At 34, Jennifer was everything Blake claimed to value in crew members: technically excellent, professionally dressed, and completely focused on safety protocols. She was also Korean American, a fact that Blake tolerated rather than embraced, though he was careful to never say anything directly discriminatory where it might be recorded or reported. "Weather looks good for Miami," Jennifer reported, her voice carrying the slight accent that Blake found mildly irritating. "Smooth flight ahead, Captain." Blake nodded absently, his attention still focused on the passenger list. In the galley, he could hear Flight Attendant Carlos Rivera preparing the first-class cabin for service. Carlos had been with Skyline for 12 years, long enough to know exactly how Blake expected things to run. He was professional efficient, and most importantly, he understood that first-class passengers deserved a different level of attention and service than the masses packed into economy. Blake had worked hard to cultivate relationships with his regular crew members, the ones who understood his standards and shared his commitment to maintaining the premium experience that justified Skyline's higher prices. He rewarded loyalty and punished dissent, creating a culture where his preferences became unwritten policy. Flight attendants learned which passengers to pay extra attention to and which ones could be safely ignored. ground crew understood which complaints to take seriously and which ones to dismiss. Over the years, Blake had accumulated dozens of passenger complaints ranging from accusations of discriminatory treatment to reports of verbal abuse. Each time he had defended himself with the same arguments. He was simply maintaining professional standards, protecting the safety of the flight, ensuring that paying customers received the service they deserved. The airline's human resources department had learned to handle these complaints quietly, usually with small gestures of compensation and carefully worded apologies that admitted no wrongdoing. Blake's personnel file contained a pattern of behavior that should have been a red flag to any competent management team, but Skyline Airways had been too focused on cost-cutting and profit margins to invest in proper oversight. His seniority and technical competence had made him essentially untouchable. A senior captain who could fly any aircraft in the fleet and who commanded respect from junior pilots and crew members. As passengers began boarding, Blake positioned himself where he could observe the first-class cabin without being obvious about it. He wanted to get a good look at this Maya Washington to assess whether she truly belonged in Seat 2A or whether she was another case of someone trying to game the upgrade system or fly on someone else's corporate account. What he saw when Maya stepped aboard confirmed every suspicion he had harbored since reading her name on the manifest. Maya approached the gate counter where Lisa Park, the ground services coordinator, was processing boarding passes with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times. Lisa was a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had been working for Skyline Airways for 15 years, long enough to develop certain assumptions about which passengers belonged in which cabins. First-class boarding, now premium passengers only, Lisa announced through her headset, her voice carrying across the gate area with practiced authority. Maya approached the podium with her phone extended, the boarding pass clearly visible on the cracked screen. Lisa looked at Maya's hoodie, her faded jeans, her worn sneakers, and then at the first-class boarding sign beside her station. The disconnect was immediate and obvious. "Miss," she said, her voice dropping into that patronizing register that service workers used when they believed they were dealing with someone who didn't understand the rules. "This is premium boarding for first-class passengers only. General boarding starts in about 15 minutes. I'm in 2A, Maya replied calmly, holding her phone steady so Lisa could scan the barcode. Her voice carried no defensiveness, no anger, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Lisa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the mismatch between Maya's appearance and her claimed seat assignment. She picked up the scanner, reluctantly, fully expecting it to flash red and confirm her suspicions that this young woman had made some kind of mistake or was attempting to board with someone else's boarding pass. The scanner beeped green, and the display lit up with information that made Lisa's eyebrows rise. Washington Maya, seat 2A. First class, full fare, Phoenix Elite status. Lisa stared at the screen, then at Maya's sneakers, then back at the screen. Phoenix Elite was Skyline's highest tier of frequent flyer status, reserved for passengers who flew more than 200,000 miles annually and spent upward of $75,000 on flights each year. There must be some system error, Lisa muttered, typing furiously on her keyboard. This shows you as Phoenix Elite, but... She gestured vaguely at Maya's appearance, unable to articulate what seemed so wrong about the situation. Maya waited patiently while Lisa ran the boarding pass through the scanner 2 more times, each beep confirming what the computer already knew: this passenger belonged exactly where she claimed to belong. Finally, with obvious reluctance, Lisa waved her through. The jet bridge was cool and sterile, filled with the recycled air that connected the terminal to the aircraft. Maya's footsteps echoed softly on the metal grating as she approached the plane's entrance, mentally preparing herself for what she knew would be the next round of questioning. The first-class cabin of Skyline's Boeing 777 was designed to impress with 16 seats arranged in a 2-2 configuration, each one wide enough to convert into a fully flat bed. The leather was soft cream, the lighting warm and inviting, and the overall atmosphere was one of luxury and exclusivity. This was the environment that justified charging $15,000 for a single ticket, the space where Skyline's most profitable passengers expected to be treated like royalty. Carlos Rivera greeted passengers at the aircraft door with the kind of warm professionalism that had made him one of Skyline's most requested flight attendants. At 36, he had learned to navigate the complex dynamics of premium cabin service, where personalities and expectations could make the difference between a smooth flight and a nightmare scenario. "Welcome aboard Flight 847 to Miami," he said as Maya stepped into the aircraft, his smile genuine and welcoming. But even Carlos, trained in customer service excellence, couldn't hide the slight flicker of confusion that crossed his face when he took in Maya's appearance. It was barely perceptible, a micro-expression that most passengers would miss, but Maya had learned to read these moments with perfect accuracy. The hoodie and jeans were triggering exactly the response she had expected. "Seat 2. Maya said simply, moving past Carlos toward the front of the cabin. She could feel his eyes following her, could sense the mental calculations he was making as he tried to reconcile her appearance with her seat assignment. That's when Captain Blake Morrison emerged from the cockpit, and Maya knew the real test was about to begin. Sophie Chen pressed her face against the small window in seat 4. Watching baggage handlers load suitcases into the cargo hold below while her grandmother settled into the seat beside her. At 8 years old, Sophie possessed the kind of unfiltered curiosity that made adults uncomfortable, the tendency to ask direct questions about things that grown-ups preferred to leave unspoken. She was traveling with her grandmother to Miami for a series of medical appointments, a trip that had required months of planning and saving. But her grandmother had insisted on first-class seats because, as she put it, some journeys deserve to be comfortable. Mrs. Chen was 73 years old with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of quiet dignity that came from surviving decades of challenges that would have broken weaker spirits. She had emigrated from Taiwan 50 years earlier with nothing but a nursing degree and an unshakable belief that America would offer opportunities for her children and grandchildren that didn't exist anywhere else. She had worked double shifts at Chicago General Hospital for 30 years, saving every possible dollar to ensure that her family would never experience the kind of poverty she had known as a child. Sophie had inherited her grandmother's direct gaze and unwillingness to pretend that uncomfortable truths didn't exist. She noticed things that adults worked hard to ignore, the way people's voices changed when they talked to her grandmother, the way store clerks followed them more closely than other customers, the way teachers at school sometimes seemed surprised when she earned perfect grades in mathematics and science. Nai Sophie whispered in Mandarin, tugging on her grandmother's sleeve. "Why does that man look angry at the Lady Mrs.?" Chen followed Sophie's gaze to where Captain Morrison was standing over the young black woman in seat 2, his posture radiating disapproval and authority. She had seen this kind of confrontation before, had experienced it herself in various forms over the decades. The specifics changed, but the underlying dynamic remained depressingly consistent. Someone in a position of power deciding that someone else didn't belong where they were. "Sometimes, little one Mrs. Chen said quietly, her English still carrying traces of the accent that had marked her as foreign for 5 decades. People make judgments based on what they see rather than what they know. It's not right, but it happens." Sophie watched, as the captain's voice grew louder, as other passengers began turning in their seats to stare at the unfolding drama. The young woman remained perfectly calm, her responses measured and dignified, but Sophie could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands remained steady even as the captain's grew more animated. But why Sophie asked, her voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby passengers turned to look at her. "She's not doing anything wrong. She's just sitting there." Mrs. Chen smiled sadly at her granddaughter's innocence, remembering her own children asking similar questions decades earlier, when they had encountered their first real experiences with prejudice. Because some people believe that having authority means they can treat others badly, especially people who look different from them. Sophie frowned, processing this information with the seriousness that she brought to all new concepts. At school, her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had talked about fairness and treating others the way you wanted to be treated. The captain wasn't following those rules at all. "Should we help her?" Sophie asked, already starting to unbuckle her seatbelt. Mrs. Chen gently placed a hand on her granddaughter's arm. Sometimes the best way to help is to be a witness to make sure that what's happening doesn't go unnoticed. Sophie nodded solemnly, understanding instinctively that she was about to witness something important, something that would become part of her own education, about how the world really worked and how it should work instead. Captain Blake Morrison approached Seat 2A with the measured steps of someone accustomed to having his authority acknowledged immediately and without question. His 25 years of commercial flying had taught him that passengers responded to confidence and clear command presence, and he had never encountered a situation that couldn't be resolved through the proper application of both. Maya looked up from her phone as his shadow fell across her seat, her dark eyes meeting his with a steadiness that he found immediately irritating. "Good morning, Blake," said his voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that masked underlying steel. "I'm Captain Morrison. I need to see your boarding pass, please." Maya held up her phone, the boarding pass clearly visible on the cracked screen. Blake made a show of examining it carefully, though he could read the relevant information at a glance. Washington Maya seat, 2A first class. What he was really doing was buying time to study her appearance more closely, looking for any detail that might justify his growing conviction that something wasn't right about this situation. "There seems to be some confusion about seating assignments," Blake said, finally his tone suggesting that he was doing Maya a favor by addressing the problem personally, rather than calling security immediately. "This seat is typically reserved for our most frequent travelers, passengers with significant history with Skyline Airways. I don't believe I've seen you in first class before." Maya's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes that Blake was too focused on his own assumptions to recognize as dangerous. "That's because you haven't been paying attention," she replied calmly. The response was not what Blake had expected. Most passengers, when confronted by a captain in uniform, became deferential, apologetic, eager to resolve any perceived conflict as quickly as possible. Maya's refusal to show appropriate respect for his authority made him more certain that she didn't belong in this cabin. Carlos Rivera, who had been arranging amenity kits in the galley, moved closer to the conversation with the careful steps of someone who had witnessed Blake's interactions with passengers before. He knew the captain's moods, understood the warning signs that indicated a situation was about to escalate beyond professional boundaries. The tension in Blake's shoulders, the way his voice had taken on that particular edge, the manner in which he was positioning himself to loom over Maya's seat. All of it pointed toward the kind of confrontation that typically ended with passenger complaints and human resources meetings. Captain Carlos said quietly, "Perhaps I could help resolve any seating issues." Blake turned toward him with the kind of cold stare that had intimidated junior crew members for decades. "I can handle this, Carlos. Please prepare the cabin for departure." It was a dismissal, clear and unambiguous, but Carlos remained nearby, instinctively understanding that Maya might need an ally in whatever was about to unfold. In the seats around them, other first-class passengers were beginning to take notice of the conversation, their morning routines interrupted by the growing tension at the front of the cabin. Mr. Thompson, a silver-haired businessman in seat 1B, who looked like he had stepped out of a Wall Street Journal advertisement, glanced up from his financial newspapers with the kind of mild interest that suggested he was accustomed to witnessing such scenes. His initial assumption, based purely on visual assessment, was that the captain was dealing with someone who had somehow obtained access to a seat they hadn't properly paid for, a situation that he believed happened more often than airlines wanted to admit. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman with carefully styled white hair and a Chanel suit in seat 3, A clutched her pearls with the kind of theatrical gesture that suggested she was already composing the story she would tell her bridge club about the incident she had witnessed in first class. Her worldview, shaped by 7 decades of privilege, automatically classified what she was seeing as a case of someone attempting to access services they hadn't earned. Miss Washington Blake said, reading the name from her boarding pass with deliberate emphasis, "I'm going to need to verify your ticket purchase information. First-class seats on this route cost approximately $15,000. That's not the kind of expense that most people can afford, especially not people who—" He gestured vaguely at her appearance, letting the implication hang in the air. Maya's response was to reach into her hoodie pocket and pull out a credit card, which she placed on the tray table between them. It was black titanium with gold lettering, the kind of exclusive payment method that most people never saw outside of movies about wealthy criminals and international conspiracies. Blake stared at the card for several seconds, his mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he understood about the situation. American Express Centurion cards weren't available to just anyone. They required invitation-only membership and annual spending that exceeded most people's total income. The card sitting in front of him represented exactly the kind of financial resources that justified first-class travel. But it belonged to someone who looked like she should be studying in a college library rather than flying premium cabins. That could be anyone's card, Blake said. Finally, his voice becoming more desperate as his certainty began to erode. Credit card fraud is more common than people think. Young people especially tend to get involved in schemes that they don't fully understand. Maya picked up the card and returned it to her pocket with movements that were deliberately slow and controlled. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a note of warning that Blake was too agitated to hear. "I suggest you return to your cockpit and prepare for departure. You're making assumptions that you're going to regret." Sophie Chen had been watching the confrontation with growing distress, her 8-year-old sense of fairness deeply offended by what she was witnessing. The captain's voice had gotten louder and meaner, and the nice lady in seat 2A seemed sad, even though she was trying to hide it. In Sophie's experience, adults who acted like the captain usually needed to be reminded about the rules for being kind to other people. "Nai, Sophie whispered urgently. "We should do something. He's being really mean to her." Mrs. Chen had been watching the interaction with the kind of grim recognition that came from decades of witnessing similar scenes in various contexts. She had seen this dynamic play out in hospital corridors, shopping centers, restaurants, and countless other spaces where people in positions of authority used their power to intimidate those they perceived as vulnerable or out of place. "Sometimes," little one Mrs. Chen said softly, "the most powerful thing we can do is show someone that they're not alone." Sophie nodded solemnly and unbuckled her seatbelt before her grandmother could stop her. She slipped out of her seat and walked down the aisle toward Maya with the fearless determination that only children possessed, carrying a small drawing pad that had been keeping her occupied during the boarding process. Blake was in the middle of explaining to Maya why her presence in first class was disrupting the premium experience for other passengers when a small voice interrupted him from knee height. "Excuse me, Mr. Sophie said, looking up at Blake with the kind of direct stare that made adults deeply uncomfortable. "Why are you being mean to the nice lady?" The question hit Blake like a physical blow, partly because it came from a child who hadn't yet learned to navigate adult social complexities with appropriate diplomacy, and partly because it forced him to confront his behavior from an outside perspective. He looked down at Sophie, taking in her school uniform and the small Korean flag pin on her backpack, and felt his irritation shift toward this new interruption. "I'm not being mean," Blake said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that adults used when they wanted children to go away. "I'm doing my job, which is making sure everyone is sitting in the right place." Sophie tilted her head to one side, considering this explanation with the seriousness she brought to math problems at school. "But she has a ticket for that seat. I saw it. And you're using your angry voice, which means you're being mean." Maya turned toward Sophie with the first genuine smile she had shown since boarding the aircraft. There was something about the child's innocent directness that cut through all the adult posturing and pretense, reducing the situation to its essential elements, one person being unkind to another for no good reason. "Hi there," Maya said gently. "What's your name?" "I'm Sophie," the girl replied, extending her drawing pad toward Maya. "I drew pictures of airplanes." "Do you want to see?" Maya accepted the pad and flipped through several pages of carefully colored aircraft in various configurations. Some realistic, others featuring rainbow wings and impossible proportions. "These are beautiful," she said sincerely. "You're a very talented artist." Sophie beamed at the praise, then turned back toward Blake with renewed confidence. "See? She's really nice. Why don't you like her?" The question was asked with such genuine curiosity that it stopped Blake completely. He found himself staring at this 8-year-old child who was asking him to explain something that he couldn't articulate without revealing the ugly assumptions that drove his behavior. How could he tell a little girl that he didn't think Maya belonged in first class because of the color of her skin? How could he explain that her appearance triggered his beliefs about who deserved premium treatment and who didn't? Mrs. Chen had approached during this exchange, moving with the quiet dignity that had carried her through 5 decades in America. She placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder while addressing Blake directly. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and managed nursing staff at a major hospital for 3 decades. "Perhaps you should consider that your assumptions about who belongs where might be incorrect." Blake looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that every first-class passenger was watching this interaction with varying degrees of fascination and discomfort. Mr. Thompson had put down his newspaper entirely. Mrs. Patterson was whispering urgently to herself, and Carlos was standing frozen in the galley with a coffee pot in his hands. "This is not appropriate," Blake said, his voice rising with frustration. "Passengers need to remain in their seats during boarding. This young woman is disrupting the entire cabin." "I'm not disrupting anything," Maya said quietly. "But you are." Blake Morrison felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers like sand, and the sensation triggered something primal in his psychology that had been shaped by decades of unchallenged authority. As a commercial airline captain, his word was literally law at 35,000 feet, where federal regulations gave him absolute power over every person aboard his aircraft. The idea that his decisions could be questioned, especially by someone he viewed as fundamentally unsuited for first-class travel, violated every assumption he held about hierarchy, order, and his place in the world. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone that preceded ultimatums. "I'm going to ask you one more time to cooperate with crew instructions and move to an appropriate seat in the economy section. Your presence here is creating a disturbance and affecting the premium experience that our first-class passengers have paid to receive." Maya remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm, despite the growing hostility radiating from the man standing over her. She had encountered countless variations of Blake Morrison throughout her career, men who believed that their authority derived from their ability to exclude others, who confused power with the right to diminish those they perceived as lesser. The difference was that this time she owned the company that employed him, controlled the board that set his salary, and possessed the authority to end his career with a single phone call. "Captain Morrison." Maya said, her voice carrying a note of finality that Blake was too agitated to recognize. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything you think you've built here. I'm giving you one last opportunity to walk away and pretend this conversation never happened." The words hit Blake like gasoline thrown on a fire. The idea that this young woman could threaten him, could suggest that she possessed any kind of leverage over his position or career, was so absurd that it triggered a rage response that overwhelmed his remaining professional instincts. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and accumulated too much seniority to be intimidated by someone who looked like she should be serving coffee rather than drinking it in first class. "Are you threatening me?" Blake asked, his voice rising to a level that could be heard throughout the cabin. Did you just threaten a commercial airline captain on a federal aircraft? Because that's a felony, young lady, and I can have you arrested and charged before we ever leave the gate. Sophie Chen, who had been coloring quietly in her grandmother's lap while listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention that children brought to situations they didn't fully understand, looked up from her drawing with worried eyes. "Nai Nai," she whispered in Mandarin. "Why is the captain being so scary? The nice lady didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Chen pulled her granddaughter closer, recognizing the signs of a confrontation that was about to spiral beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. She had witnessed enough workplace drama during her nursing career to understand that Blake Morrison was operating on pure emotion now, his professional judgment compromised by wounded pride and the kind of rage that led to career-ending mistakes. Carlos Rivera moved closer to the scene, his training in conflict de-escalation telling him that intervention was necessary, even if it meant challenging his captain's authority. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in private." Blake whirled toward him with eyes that were blazing with frustrated authority. "Carlos I told you to prepare the cabin for departure. This passenger is being uncooperative and disruptive, and she just made what sounded very much like a threat against a flight crew member." "Sir, she hasn't been disruptive," Carlos replied, his voice steady despite the career risk he was taking by contradicting his captain. "She's been sitting quietly in her assigned seat with a valid boarding pass and appropriate identification." The truth of Carlos's statement only made Blake angrier because it forced him to confront the gap between his perception of the situation and observable reality. Maya hadn't raised her voice, hadn't been rude to other passengers, hadn't violated any actual regulation or policy. Her only crime was existing in a space where Blake believed she didn't belong, and his inability to articulate this without revealing his own bias was driving him toward increasingly desperate measures. "She's playing games," Blake said, gesturing wildly toward Maya. "Look at her. She's sitting there acting like she owns the place, like the rules don't apply to her, like she can say whatever she wants without consequences." Maya looked up at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "Captain Morrison," she said softly, "I do own this place." The words were spoken so quietly that several passengers had to strain to hear them, but their impact was immediate and devastating. Blake stared at her for several seconds, processing what she had said, and finding it so impossible to believe that his mind simply rejected the information entirely. "That's it," he said, reaching for Maya's arm. "You're getting off this aircraft right now." Blake Morrison's hand closed around Maya's upper arm with a grip that was designed to hurt his fingers digging into the soft fabric of her hoodie and the flesh beneath. It was the kind of physical dominance that he had probably used countless times before to assert his authority over people he deemed unworthy of respect, the instinctive move of someone who believed that his position gave him the right to handle others as he saw fit. "Let go of me," Maya said, her voice cutting through the cabin with absolute clarity. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the cabin turn to stare at her. Blake's response was to tighten his grip, his face flushing red with the kind of rage that overwhelmed rational thought. "You don't get to give me orders on my aircraft. You're going to get up and walk off this plane right now, or I'm going to have security drag you off in handcuffs." Sophie Chen let out a small cry of distress, burying her face against her grandmother's shoulder as the adult conversation became something frightening and violent. Mrs. Chen wrapped her arms around her granddaughter while staring at Blake with the kind of cold judgment that only someone who had survived decades of similar treatment could muster. Carlos Rivera moved forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Captain, please let go of the passenger. This isn't appropriate." "Stay back, Carlos." Blake snapped, his voice shaking with adrenaline and fury. "This woman has been disruptive and threatening since she boarded this aircraft." She's exactly the kind of passenger who ruins the premium experience for everyone else. Maya jerked her arm free from his grasp with a movement that was sharp and decisive, the kind of controlled violence that spoke of self-defense training and absolute refusal to be victimized. "I told you to let go of me," she said, her voice still eerily calm despite the assault she had just experienced. Blake stared at her for a moment, his mind struggling to process the fact that she had physically resisted his authority, that she had dared to break free from his grip instead of submitting to his control. The rejection of his dominance triggered something primal and ugly in his psychology, a reaction that bypassed every filter of professional training and social conditioning. His hand moved before his brain could catch up with his actions, swinging in a wide arc that connected with Maya's face with a sound like a gunshot. The slap echoed through the first-class cabin with sickening clarity, followed immediately by a silence so profound that it seemed to suck all the air out of the aircraft. Maya's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, her hoodie falling back to reveal more of her face. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth, where Blake's ring had caught her lip, and the left side of her face began to show the angry red mark that would soon become a bruise. Sophie Chen screamed the high, piercing sound of a child witnessing violence that her young mind couldn't process or understand. The scream seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone else in the cabin, and suddenly the first-class section erupted in chaos. Mr. Thompson jumped to his feet, his newspaper scattering to the floor. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted at Blake, his own voice shaking with shock and outrage. Mrs. Patterson clutched her chest with both hands, her face pale with horror. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, he hit her." Carlos Rivera lunged forward, putting himself between Blake and Maya with the protective instincts of someone who had finally seen enough. Captain Morrison stepped away from the passenger. Immediately, he said, his voice carrying new authority, born of moral certainty. Jennifer Kim appeared at the cockpit door, drawn by the commotion and the sound of Sophie's scream. She took in the scene at a glance, the captain standing over a passenger with his hand still raised, blood on the passenger's lip, a crying child, and the entire first-class cabin staring in shock and disbelief. Maya touched the corner of her mouth with her fingertip, examining the blood with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she was cataloging evidence rather than processing trauma. When she looked up at Blake, her eyes held something that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice perfectly steady despite the assault she had just endured, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Maya Washington reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her cracked phone with movements that were deliberate and controlled, each gesture calculated to project calm authority despite the blood still trickling from the corner of her mouth. The first-class cabin had fallen into the kind of stunned silence that followed acts of violence where shock temporarily overwhelmed the ability to process what had just happened. Blake Morrison stood frozen in the aisle, his hand still tingling from the impact of striking her, his mind struggling to comprehend that he had just committed assault in front of multiple witnesses on a federal aircraft. Carlos Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Please hand me some tissues." Carlos Rivera moved immediately, pulling a small pack of tissues from his service kit and offering them to Maya with hands that were visibly shaking. He had witnessed countless difficult passenger interactions during his 12 years with Skyline Airways, but he had never seen a captain physically assault someone who was simply sitting in their assigned seat. Maya dabbed at the cut on her lip while navigating through her phone's contact list, her thumb moving with practiced efficiency despite the cracked screen. The device itself looked like something a college student might carry, but the interface that appeared when she unlocked it was unlike anything the watching passengers had ever seen. The background was sleek black with gold text, and the contact list contained entries that read like a directory of American corporate and political power. "Who are you calling?" Blake demanded, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who was beginning to realize that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to control. "You can't make phone calls during boarding. Federal regulations prohibit the use of electronic devices when I'm calling. David Park. Maya replied calmly, finding the contact she wanted. He's the CEO of Skyline Airways. Blake's face went white as he read the contact name over her shoulder. David Park was indeed the CEO of Skyline Airways, the man who had hired Blake 25 years earlier, the executive who signed off on captain assignments and salary reviews. But there was absolutely no way that this young woman could have his personal cell phone number, let alone be calling him by his first name. "That's impossible," Blake said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't know David Park. You're some kind of con artist running an elaborate scam." Maya tapped the contact and put the phone on speaker, the sound of the ringtone filling the cabin with crystal clarity. Around them, the other first-class passengers leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered clear and immediate through the speaker. Maya David Park said, his tone carrying the kind of warmth and deference that he typically reserved for board members and major investors. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until you landed in Miami. Is everything all right? How's the service on Flight 847? The sound of David Park's voice speaking Maya's name with obvious familiarity sent a shockwave through the cabin. Blake Morrison's legs nearly gave out beneath him as he recognized his CEO's distinctive baritone, the same voice he had heard in countless company meetings and training sessions over the past quarter-century. Sophie Chen stopped crying and looked up from her grandmother's shoulder with wide, curious eyes. Even she could sense that something important was happening, that the phone call was changing the entire atmosphere in the cabin. "No, David," Maya replied, her voice carrying clearly through the speaker. "The service is not all right. In fact, it's so far from all right that I think we need to have a serious conversation about the culture of this company and the people you've put in positions of authority." The silence that followed was so profound that passengers could hear the ambient noise of the aircraft's electrical systems, the gentle hum of air conditioning, and the distant sounds of ground crew preparing for departure. When David Park spoke again, his voice was tight with concern and what sounded like genuine fear. "What happened, Maya? Tell me exactly what's going on." Maya never broke eye contact with Blake as she delivered her response with devastating calm. "Captain Blake Morrison just physically assaulted me in the first-class cabin of this aircraft. He slapped me across the face because he decided that I didn't belong in seat 2A. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Mr. Thompson made a small sound of amazement, Mrs. Patterson whispered, "Dear God," under her breath, and Carlos Rivera closed his eyes as if he were witnessing the end of someone's career in real time. He did what David Park's voice was barely audible, filled with a horror that was palpable even through the phone's small speaker. "He assaulted me," Maya repeated, touching the swelling side of her face gently. "After questioning my ticket, grabbing my arm, and making it clear that he believes people like me don't belong in premium cabins. He did this in front of multiple witnesses, including an 8-year-old child who is now traumatized by what she's seen." Blake tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but no sound came out. His throat had gone completely dry, and his tongue felt thick and useless in his mouth. The reality of what he had done was beginning to penetrate his consciousness like ice water in his veins. Maya David Park said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I am so sorry. I don't have words for how sorry I am. This is unconscionable. This will never happen again. There's more, David." Maya continued, her voice still terrifyingly calm. "He did this after I warned him that he was making a mistake. He did it after I told him exactly who I am. Captain Morrison chose to assault the owner of this airline rather than acknowledge that his assumptions about who belongs where might be wrong." The final piece of information hit Blake Morrison like a physical blow. Owner. Not frequent flyer, not VIP passenger, not even board member. Owner. The word echoed in his mind as the full magnitude of his situation began to dawn on him. "Dear God," David Park whispered. "Maya, I'm calling airport security immediately. Don't move, don't do anything. I'm coming to that aircraft personally." Within minutes of Maya's phone call, the jet bridge filled with the sound of heavy footsteps as Chicago airport police officers boarded Flight 847, followed closely by David Park and several Skyline Airways executives who had been hastily summoned from the company's headquarters downtown. The first-class cabin, which had been a scene of violence and chaos just moments earlier, suddenly became the center of a carefully orchestrated response that would reshape everything about how the airline operated. David Park appeared at the aircraft door looking like a man who had dressed hastily and driven through Chicago traffic at dangerous speeds to reach the airport. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, and his face carried the kind of pale intensity that came from contemplating the complete destruction of a corporate reputation. He moved through the cabin with the focused urgency of someone who understood that every second of delay was another second of liability and public relations disaster. When he reached Maya's seat, Park dropped to one knee beside her chair, lowering himself to her eye level in a gesture of complete deference and respect that was not lost on the watching passengers. "Maya," he said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. This is unacceptable. This is a complete failure of leadership, and the responsibility sits squarely on my shoulders." Maya looked at him with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, though the swelling on her face had become more pronounced and the cut on her lip was still visible. "David," she said simply, "we have a serious cultural problem that goes far beyond one captain's behavior." Officer Michael Rodriguez of the Chicago Airport Police approached Blake Morrison, who was standing in the aisle like a statue, his face cycling through shades of white and red as the full implications of his actions began to register. Rodriguez was a veteran of 20 years in law enforcement, and he had seen enough workplace violence to recognize the signs of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. Captain Morrison Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had made thousands of arrests, "You're under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sound of handcuffs clicking into place seemed to echo through the cabin with unusual clarity, a metallic punctuation mark that signaled the end of Blake Morrison's career and the beginning of a legal process that would follow him for years to come. As the officers led him toward the aircraft door, his legs moved mechanically, but his mind was still struggling to process the reality of his situation. "This can't be happening," Blake said weakly, looking back at Maya one final time. "I was just maintaining standards. I was protecting the integrity of first class." Maya stood up and walked toward him despite David Park's gesture for her to remain seated. Even in handcuffs, Blake was still taller than her, but somehow she seemed to tower over him with the quiet authority of someone who controlled his entire professional existence. "Captain Morrison," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "The only thing you were protecting was your own prejudice. And now you've lost everything because you couldn't see past the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing." As the officers escorted Blake from the aircraft, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman in seat 3A, who had spent the entire confrontation clutching her pearls and whispering to herself, began to clap. The applause was slow and deliberate, clearly directed at Maya rather than at the spectacle of Blake's arrest. "Well done, dear," Mrs. Patterson said in a voice that carried decades of social authority. "I've been flying for 60 years and I've never seen such disgraceful behavior from airline personnel, Mr." Thompson joined in the applause, his earlier assumptions about Maya completely reversed by the revelation of her true identity and the dignity with which she had handled an impossible situation. One by one, the other first-class passengers began clapping, creating a sustained wave of support that followed Blake all the way down the jet bridge. Carlos Rivera approached Maya hesitantly, his eyes still wide with shock at what he had witnessed. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I want to apologize for not intervening sooner. I should have done more to protect you from Captain Morrison's behavior." Maya turned to him with an expression that was both kind and evaluating. "Carlos, you did everything you could within the constraints of a difficult situation. You showed professionalism and courage when it mattered most." She looked at David Park. "I want Carlos promoted to senior flight attendant immediately, and I want him transferred to our customer experience team." David Park nodded without hesitation. "Done. Whatever changes you want to implement, whatever restructuring is necessary, you have my complete support." 18 months later, Blake Morrison sat in a small conference room at the Chicago Community Justice Center, facing a circle of chairs occupied by airline employees, passengers who had experienced discrimination, and community leaders who worked on civil rights issues. His platinum blonde hair had grown out, revealing gray roots that he no longer bothered to dye, and his face carried the kind of weathered exhaustion that came from losing everything he had thought defined him as a person. The orange jumpsuit he had worn during his 6-month incarceration had been replaced by simple civilian clothes, a button-down shirt and khakis that belonged to someone who was rebuilding his life from the ground up. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked. His pension forfeited. His marriage ended when his wife couldn't handle the public shame that had followed his assault conviction. But somewhere in the wreckage of his former life, Blake had found something he hadn't possessed in decades: the ability to see his own behavior clearly and the courage to confront what he had become. "My name is Blake Morrison," he said to the group, his voice carrying none of the authority that had once defined his interactions with others. 18 months ago, I was a commercial airline captain with 25 years of experience and a belief that my uniform gave me the right to decide who belonged where. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of other things." The words came slowly at first, each admission like pulling glass from a wound that had been infected for years. Blake had spent his time in prison working with a counselor who specialized in helping people confront their unconscious biases, a process that had been more painful than any physical punishment the legal system could have imposed. "I slapped Maya Washington because she challenged my authority, but that's not really why I did it," Blake continued. "I did it because she was a young black woman who refused to accept my belief that she didn't belong in first class. I did it because looking at her forced me to confront assumptions I had held for my entire adult life." In the audience, Carlos Rivera listened with the focused attention of someone who had witnessed the original incident and understood its broader implications. He had accepted Maya's offer to join Skyline's customer experience team, where he now trained other airline employees to recognize and interrupt discriminatory behavior before it escalated to violence. "The truth is," Blake said, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the admission, "I had been treating passengers differently based on their appearance for years. Maya Washington wasn't the first person I had harassed or intimidated. She was just the first person who had the power to hold me accountable for it." Near the back of the room, Maya Washington herself sat quietly listening to Blake's testimony, with the same calm attention she had brought to their original confrontation. She attended these sessions not out of any obligation to forgive her attacker, but because she had learned that transformation was a process that required witnesses, and sometimes the people who had been harmed were the only ones who could verify that change was real. "I can't undo what I did." Blake continued, looking directly at Maya for the first time since beginning his statement. "I can't take back the violence or erase the trauma I caused. But I can make sure that other people learn from my mistakes without having to make them themselves." After the session ended, Blake approached Maya with the hesitant steps of someone who understood that his presence might be unwelcome but felt compelled to try anyway. "Ms. Washington," he said, I know that apologizing doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I understand what I did to you and why it was wrong. Maya studied him for a long moment, taking in the changes that prison and counseling had wrought in his appearance and bearing. "Blake," she said finally, "the person you are now is not the same person who assaulted me on that aircraft. I can see that. The question is whether you can sustain this version of yourself when it's difficult and when nobody is watching." Blake nodded, understanding that her conditional acceptance was more than he had any right to expect. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to answer that question in a way that honors what you've built here." 2 years after the incident on Flight 847, Maya Washington stood before the Senate Transportation Committee in Washington, D.C., delivering testimony that would reshape federal aviation policy and establish new standards for bias prevention training throughout the airline industry. The hearing room was packed with reporters, aviation executives, and civil rights advocates who understood that they were witnessing the kind of moment that created lasting change. Discrimination in commercial aviation isn't just a customer service issue, Maya told the assembled senators, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed a single moment of injustice into a movement that spanned industries. When airline employees are trained to judge passengers based on their appearance rather than their behavior, it creates an environment where real security threats can be overlooked and where basic human dignity becomes a privilege rather than a right. Sophie Chen, now 10 years old and seated in the gallery next to her grandmother, listened with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. The little girl who had tried to comfort Maya on that terrible morning had become a symbol of moral courage, her innocent questions about fairness, inspiring a children's book series about standing up for others that was being read in schools across the country. Blake Morrison, sitting in the back row of the hearing room, took careful notes as Maya outlined the Washington Protocols, a comprehensive set of policies that had been adopted by every major airline in America. His presence there was part of his ongoing commitment to advocacy work, speaking to pilot training programs about the dangers of unconscious bias and the importance of treating every passenger with equal dignity. After the hearing, as reporters surrounded Maya with questions about future policy initiatives, Sophie approached with the fearless determination that had marked her personality since childhood. "Ms. Washington," she said, tugging on Maya's jacket, "I brought you something." Sophie handed Maya a new drawing, this one showing an airplane with rainbow wings and passengers of every color and age looking happy through the windows. At the bottom, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Everyone belongs." Maya knelt down to Sophie's eye level, accepting the drawing with the kind of gentle reverence that she might have shown a priceless work of art. "This is beautiful, Sophie. Thank you for reminding me why all of this work matters." Mrs. Chen approached, her face glowing with pride at her granddaughter's continued courage. "She talks about that day often," she told Maya quietly, "about how you stayed calm when someone was being cruel to you and how you used your power to make things better for everyone else." As they left the Capitol building together, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought them from a moment of violence and injustice to this place of policy change and hope. The work wasn't finished, would probably never be completely finished, but every person who now flew without fear of discrimination was a testament to the possibility that individual courage could create collective transformation. The sky above Washington was clear and boundless, full of aircraft carrying passengers who all knew they belonged wherever their dreams could take them. 2 years later, Sophie Chen, now 10 years old, walked confidently down the jet bridge at Chicago O'Hare, her small hand gripping her grandmother's, while her other hand clutched an acceptance letter to a prestigious summer aviation camp that would be her first step toward becoming a pilot. The little girl, who had once witnessed hatred and violence in an aircraft cabin, now moved through airports with the unshakable belief that she belonged anywhere she chose to go, that the sky itself was not too vast for her dreams. Blake Morrison, now working as a diversity trainer for the Federal Aviation Administration, watched Sophie board from the gate area where he was conducting interviews for a documentary about transformation and redemption in the aviation industry. He saw in her confident stride the proof that change was possible, that moments of darkness could become catalysts for light if people had the courage to confront their own capacity for both harm and healing. Maya Washington's voice came over the intercom as the aircraft pushed back from the gate, her words reaching passengers who knew that dignity wasn't an upgrade to be earned, but a birthright to be honored. "Welcome aboard, everyone," she said simply. "You all belong here, and we're honored to take you wherever you're going." The plane lifted into blue sky, carrying passengers who understood that justice wasn't just about punishment, but about the possibility that people and systems could change one flight, one moment of courage, one child's innocent question at a time. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to see more stories about ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up for what's right can change everything, even when the odds seem impossible. Your voice matters, your courage matters, and together we can build a world where everyone truly belongs.